Hey everybody, welcome to The Realign. This is episode 13, and I am with James A. Smith. James A. Smith, well, let's just call you James, right?
You can call me
do I
whatever
need
you
to,
like, Reed.
dude, mate, I don't know. James is the host of what has become kind of my favorite podcast, even though I cannot possibly keep up with you because your output is pretty intense. It's called The Popular Show, which is a great name for it, especially since, well, one, it should be more popular than it is, and I think one day it will be incredibly
The
popular.
name is going to make a lot of sense in retrospect. We're still getting
Yeah, but it also very works too because I feel like a lot of your critiques are much more. I don't want to say populist, but kind of populist. You know, there's a sense where you. So if you haven't listened to The Popular Show. There's always this from the left, this perspective of like, hey, we are completely missing out on actually what people feel and think, and I think part of your critiques for quite some time have been, I want to call you part of the dissident left, maybe. And I'm part of that as well. But maybe the better description is the disappointed left. That there's been a lot of us who just looking around at what's happened, especially around the COVID time. It was like, what's happening to the left? I don't understand it. Do I belong here anymore? And I'm just going to keep talking, but some of us just kind of left. Left the left. Some of us were just I can't deal with this. This doesn't make any sense anymore. And then others. And I think, including you, have just said, well, I'm just going to keep talking about these things anyway. And I'm not going to care if this mass trend, and let's call it a trend or even a fad of a kind of authoritarian statists, but also liberal capitalist left, while it kind of plays itself out because there's still some people who want to hear and it still want to be leftist. Some of these ideas still make sense to some of us. It's just no one's talking to them anymore. And I feel like you've been doing that really well.
Well, thank you, Reed. Yeah, I've never really been tempted to announce my departure from the left. I think a lot of people who at various points have declared how shocked they are that the left is misbehaving on this issue or has taken the wrong turn on that issue. We shouldn't be shocked given the class composition of the left today. It's a lot bigger than it's been at any previous time of my life, but a lot of that influx of people has come from sort of disappointed graduates, millennials, who are they're coming to left-wing politics more because neoliberalism hasn't delivered for them. It hasn't delivered the secure professional career that they thought they were going to have, and so they turn to radical left politics, and that's okay, but it shouldn't be a surprise to us that comes with certain pathologies, certain tensions, and those are problems that need fighting and correcting, as opposed to a kind of wholesale rejection or denouncement. On the other hand, on the Popular Show, we've been very, I think, uniquely comfortable with talking to Trump people, talking to Brexit people, talking, while Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, some of the people around him, because, for all the standard left-wing reaction to right-wing populism is, they're pretending, they're only, doing this to get votes. Well, it's a good thing if there seems to be a powerful enough left, as there was with Corbin and Bernie, if the right thinks that it has to emulate traditional left arguments, even if it has to sort of follow through on some of this stuff. The fact that Trump won that way, and the fact that Boris Johnson, for as long as he was Prime Minister, felt that he had to be doing something a little bit like a kind of Corbynite infrastructure project. This was before COVID and Ukraine sent him off course. I think that the left shouldn't be hysterical when that happens. It should say, well, okay, insofar as some of the people in your movement are sincere about this, we're happy to have conversations and happy to support you. So in general, I'd say the tone of the popular show is unhysterical. You can't shock me. You can't shock me when the left misbehaves, and you can't shock me when the right misbehaves.
I think unhysterical is actually perfect. There's a calmness to it. It's like, yeah, okay, this is how it goes. I would love to talk a little bit more about the way that that right populism and left populism, if they're, if you can really call left populist lately, it's kind of played out, I guess, since 2016. Like, my experience, of course, was from the United States. I left right after the election of Trump, right before I was there for the inauguration of Trump. I actually went to Washington, D.C. and wore a pussy hat.
It's been quite a journey.
It's been quite a journey, yeah. And so my sense, and I felt like I was completely in a minority at that point, although in retrospect, I think there are other people who understood this as well, but were just afraid to talk about it. But in my sense, so the option was Trump or Hillary. And I remember specifically, the tension between, Trump's "Make America Great Again" and Hillary's "No, America's already great." What she had been pushing was this idea that everything is already fine. Why are you guys even complaining? What's going on? Anybody who's complaining, there's something wrong with them. They're deplorables. They're not someone to be listened to. And yet, I would see people that would fit into what we used to call the working class or whatever, saying, well, actually, yeah, Hillary's wrong. Like, things aren't good for me. And so Trump's, hey, I'm going to fix everything, of course, resonated much more readily with them, even if some of the other things he was saying they didn't like. At least they wanted someone to acknowledge the problems, which they had as an option with Bernie Sanders, but that didn't last. And it seems like since then that tension has never really been resolved, especially on the American left in all of its forms. There's a continued sense that no matter what, America is generally doing fine. People are generally doing fine, and if people feel like they're not doing fine, especially with the traditional working class, many of which are white, but not all of them are white. There are plenty of black people, there are plenty of Hispanic people working in factories still. That actually tends to be a little bit of a higher population in some industries. And when they say we're not doing well, there's an immediate dismissal that, oh no, actually they're just racist. So there's always been this kind of no, your critique does not matter, and here's why it doesn't matter. This is the label we're going to put on your critique so that we don't have to listen to you. And then at the same time, there's been this populist right, which has said, well, actually, yeah, no, things are not good, and we're gonna promise to fix this. No, they haven't. But that's been going on since 2016, maybe even longer. But that's when I really became aware of this strange tension where the left no longer even tried to talk to industrial workers, manufacturers, the kind of traditional working class. And so you've seen the same thing in the UK, of course. Can you talk first of all, like some of the stuff, since not everybody is familiar with how things have gone, like for example,
sure.
With Brexit.
I think that there is a reasonable parallel to be made between the trajectory of the Corbyn project and the trajectory of the Bernie project, and you can group it around the differences between the two major elections that both men participated in. So for Bernie, the 2016 primary campaign, where he overperformed against Hillary, and thus the Bernie bros were never really forgiven and became a sort of object of hate equal to hatred of Trump supporters among those kinds of elite liberal establishment Dems. The parallel there would be the 2017 general election in the UK, where Corbyn, as Labour leader, really overperformed, got 40% of the vote, which would have been a majority in any previous election in the 21st century, and deprived Theresa May of her majority. This was more shocking than Bernie's over performance. We go from that 2016-2017 moment to 2019 election in the UK and the 2020 primary for Bernie, and something has changed. For one thing, the party establishments of Labour and the Democrats and the general media ecosystem are a lot more forearmed and forewarned about left populism. They take it more seriously, and thus you've had years of denigration and delegitimization of those left populist politicians and their supporters. But I still don't think that was insurmountable. I think that ultimately the blame has to lie with the leaders and their movements themselves. The difference between 2016-2017 and 2019-2020 is that in the 2016-2017 moment, the attitude is much like the one that you're describing yourself having towards Trump supporters. That there is an intuitive understanding that the mainstreams of both main parties, this is in Britain and America, are completely rancid, completely corrupt, and have completely failed on every salient issue that the 21st century has presented, both foreign and domestic. And I think there was an intuitive understanding on the part of this kind of new electoral left that was emerging, that the rightists around Trump and the rightists around Brexit did have a legitimate complaint, and even if they weren't giving the right answers, they were asking the right questions. And so for me there was a beautiful and absolutely necessary combination at work then, whereby the left understood that it had to avoid the temptation of siding with the liberal part of the political class and the political establishment, and it had to avoid buying into their claim that Trump and the right wing of the Tory party in the UK were a sort of unique evil, that there needed to be this coalition against. Rather, the left was able to say, no, fuck you both. We are our own autonomous project. We are not just a sort of left flank of the more liberal party. And actually, we do think that those people who are going for Trump and going for Brexit have a lot of legitimacy, and we want a project that can appeal to them. Thus, Bernie in 2016, going on Fox News, having a class-first program that was very similar in its portrait of American carnage, as Steve Bannon wrote in Trump's inaugural address, a very similar analysis to Trump. Similarly, in the UK, the 2017 Labour manifesto, which was so successful, accepted Brexit wholesale, and it designed its economic programme around the new economic sovereignty that Brexit did allow for. It had the golden formula of saying to those voters who didn't think of themselves as on the left, those petty bourgeois tradespeople, those working class people who either didn't vote or had never thought of voting Labour and certainly hadn't thought of voting for a radical left party, it said to them, look, many of our supporters, many people in our party don't agree with you on Brexit, but we're going to take your word for it, we're going to roll the dice, and we accept your argument. Number two, did you know that we actually care about a lot of the same things that you do? We want to make massive investments in infrastructure. We're on your side. And three, did you realise that we've actually got arguments that you might agree with if you hear about them? That's where the foreign policy kind of string came in, and there were surprises during the 2017 UK election where, you know, opinion polling revealed that people were actually changing their minds about foreign policy as a result of Corbyn's speeches. So that was the sort of golden moment of left populism, where the left was able to make that kind of reaching across and reveal that kinship that it actually had with a lot of these nominally right-wing voters. It was as if these kinds of educated millennial leftists were realizing that they were coming down in the world, they were downly mobile, and they were meeting and realizing that they had material interests in common with poorer people in the country, and were able to work outward from that. What happened between that 2016-2017 moment and the 2019-2020 moment is that the sort of the middle class element of the left got the upper hand. There were so many temptations. Me Too, not so, you know, Black Lives Matter existed, but it hadn't had its big burst that it had in 2020. But still, there were temptations of sort of liberal race politics in the air. In Britain, the temptation was to actually say, no, Brexit is racist, we've got to oppose Brexit. In America, the temptation was to say, actually, Trump is this unique fascist figure. We have to be anti-Trump. We have to be never Trump, etc. The temptation of those more liberal strands within the left coalitions started to be too strong, and we lost that understanding, that populist grasp that we had in the previous arrangement. And
can I ask you a question there? Because like you call it temptation, but like I'm thinking, you know, the way that accusations of anti-Semitism, for example, kind of just you know, they didn't destroy Corbyn, but that was the theme, as well as the, you know, if anybody wants Brexit, then they must be a racist and a fascist and a nationalist, etc. In the United States, the backlash was both racism and misogyny. Those were the two, and it's like that was what the more middle class establishment of the Liberal Party, the Democratic Party, was pushing, and I feel like that was less offering a temptation for people to kind of listen to, and more like a whip, you know, like that we will smear you utterly if you do not fall in line. And that was, you know, no one wants to be called anti-Semitic. No one wants to be anti-Semitic. Maybe there's a few people who want to be anti-Semitic, but no one wants that accusation. No one wants to be called a misogynist or a racist, or even a fascist, at least on the left. So, you know, it was more a whip. Like, you know, hey, if you do this, then, you know, we will smear you, and you will be a complete outcast to everybody because we will, you know, hang this label upon you, and you will be destroyed. And that was really successful.
Yes. There is one of the left pathologies is a sort of fascination with self-criticism, with the mea culpa, which is more often the "you culpa." I think an under sort of rated dimension of the whole Mark Fisher Vampire Castle thing is that quite a lot of it is it's almost a sort of academic love of critique for its own sake. So sure. As much as when anti-Semitism allegations were made against Corbyn supporters or misogyny allegations were made against Bernie bros, as much as that did present a kind of, you know, at the top of left organisations, these sort of accusations are always useful for getting rid of your rivals. Like, you know, you could breathe a sigh of relief when that other kind of up-and-coming organiser gets hit with some kind of accusation of that kind. But there's also a way that it was very difficult to just present a united front and say, look, I'm sure anti-Semitism is a complicated thing. The only reason we're hearing so much about it now is because of your desire to delegitimize the left, and for some of you to defend Israel, which I think is pretty clear now. But instead of doing that, there was an element of, oh wow, maybe I am anti-Semitic. Maybe on some level I am. Let's really talk about this in front of everyone online. It's the same bourgeois impulse that accounts for the success of the whole, anti-racism training. Why do elite companies love getting usually a white woman in to tell them how racist they are? Because this is an elite mindset that it's only those oiks out there who don't realize how racist and sexist they are deep down. It's a marker of my superiority that I'm able to self-critique and look inside my soul and realize my prejudices. So I think there was I think it was a bourgeois impulse on the part of those lefts to sort of encourage or cultivate those criticisms of misogyny and racism, because on some level there is a pleasure in analysing yourself in that way, quite apart from the more obvious interpretation of feeling perfectly at home with that kind of cancel culture thing, or indeed feeling panics that, oh my God, perhaps a lot of these people were very new to any kind of activism and any kind of politics. So there was an element of like, oh my God, what have I got myself into? Maybe these people are what all the papers are saying they are.
Did you know that Amazon does land acknowledgements in the United States when they hold their meetings?
It doesn't surprise me at all.
And having grown up in an activist milieu, etc., where that was a big thing. Like learning that, I was like, oh wow, okay, this is how quickly they've been able to adapt to this. Hey, I'm not really supposed to be here, but by telling you that I'm not supposed to be here, I therefore assert my right to actually be here.
It's the same reason that all the Ivy Leagues, I mean, are they still masking over there? It's exactly the same thing that all of the elite American universities kept stringent COVID measures much longer than anyone else. That it used to be that elites showed how powerful they were by being allowed to, the seigneur is allowed to fuck any daughter in the village.
Right.
You show you're the only one wearing a golden cloak, etc. Now it's the opposite rhetoric. You show that you're an elite by how you deprive yourself. I'm going to insult myself with the worst accusations of anti-Semitism and racism. I'm going to deprive myself. The normal people living in the town around this university can go to restaurants and nightclubs, but we, the great scholars, cannot. It's a rhetoric of deprivation.
You probably maybe know this, like the largest Socialism Conference in the United States, which isn't very large because it's the United States, right? And I believe it was originally started by several socialist groups, one of which like just completely imploded, the International Socialist Organization, the ISO. There's a story there actually that's quite fascinating, but it needs to be told by somebody else. It's not a big interest of me or of mine. But they had mandatory masking at all of their events, and mandatory testing as well. So if you were going to be a speaker, you needed to test at the table beforehand so that you did not infect any of the good socialists there. And now, like I've always thought, and let's definitely talk about how things changed with COVID. But like I'll start this out with noting something that I feel like is missed on all sides, which is that Americans don't have access to healthcare like we do in Europe or you do in the UK. I've still not gotten COVID. I got the one-shot Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I've managed to not get it at all. But if I got it, I can go to a doctor and it's going to cost me 50 euros that gets reimbursed by the government. And that's it. With the medications, they're all going to be cheap because they're state funded, state subsidized. In the United States, if you get COVID, not only are you going to have to pay a very large doctor bill if you require going to a doctor, but you're not even guaranteed paid time off for it. So I think at least in that context, which is something that as extreme as a lot of the COVID stuff has been, the masking cult almost right now, where I don't know if you heard about this or not, but a couple of weeks ago, I think it was in early December, there was an event in Portland where an anarchist book fair got sabotaged by self-identified trans anti-eugenicists, because the anarchists were not wearing, or they were not all wearing masks at this event. So they threw, they had mixed human feces in plastic bottles with water and then smeared it everywhere and tried to attack. So it was this big fight, because of course people who don't wear masks are trying to kill all disabled people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in that context, that stuff is crazy. It's absolutely crazy. At the same time, those people, if they get COVID, if they had a job, they're not going to get to keep their job, because if they're out for 2 weeks, there's no guarantee that they can go back to work after being sick. That being said, absolutely something really strange happened with the left. And you talked about this in a conversation recently about how a lot of that activist left energy that had been going into Corbyn and to Bernie just kind of pivoted immediately into becoming pro-masking, demanding that the government do more. In the United States, and I often wonder too, if COVID had started, if that had become a thing when Trump was not in power, what that might have looked like. Because in the United States, immediately everybody identified not doing anything strict as far as regulations, vaccine mandates, all of that, with Trump. So that it was a right-wing thing not to do that. Even though had a Democrat been president at the same time, they would have also had said, I don't know if we can do this. But anyway, yeah, so let's talk about what you've seen and how that shaped the way that the left has gone about stuff. I mean, of course the left lost a lot of credibility from many of their actions there.
Yes. Well, I think that it's important on the left to know when to act, when to take what Walter Benjamin used to describe as the tiger's leap into that little opening of opportunity that has always characterized major historical change. And it's also important to know when to withdraw and when not to act. And part of the psychology of Corbynism, and the same was true, I'm sure, of Bernieism, was one of constantly putting out fires. There's always some new allegation or new kind of crisis that we all have to jump onto Twitter in order to refute. There's always more doors to knock on. There's always more that you can be doing. That hyperactivity that for many of us was 4 years of activity. It's hard to retire that. So after Corbyn lost at the end of 2019, there's then a few melancholy months, which frankly I can't name a single thing that happened between the election in 2019 and the start of COVID in March. Then suddenly here's COVID, and suddenly this is where we're going to be vindicated, because Boris Johnson is going to be so bad, and everyone's going to realise that Corbyn would have been good and would have been better than Boris Johnson. This is when we're going to be vindicated on the necessity of massive state investment, and in our kind of relativising the importance of work and economy, all of these left ideas, it's going to be Corbynism by other means. And that was combined with a huge paranoia, somewhat justified, a paranoia that liberal journalists, the BBC, the kind of the liberal wing of the establishment was in cahoots with Boris Johnson, that they had obviously sided with Boris Johnson in the election to get rid of Corbyn, and so you couldn't trust anyone, really. And so when COVID came along, people were scared of the disease, and people on the left had these other sorts of mental forces going on of excitement that there was something else to put that energy into, and also a sense that you were justified in taking the most hysterical, the most pro-intervention position possible, because not only could you not trust the government, you couldn't even trust the normal, supposedly impartial wings of the media either. So, I mean, I find it very interesting that Novara Media, which I've got a lot of respect for in a lot of regards, I subscribed to them for a long time when Corbyn was leader. Novara Media, I guess a sort of British version of Majority Report or something like that, they grew far more during COVID than they did during Corbynism. And that sort of sense in which the left went from being, propagandists for a particular leader and a particular electoral project, and for many of us a class project, switching to becoming propagandists for measures that were being recommended or instated or produced by supranational bodies and then rolled out by individual national governments. This was a very different thing, but it was the exact same energy that was going into it. People who had checked social media every day for the latest on Corbyn were now checking social media every day for the latest on COVID. And people who had spent a lot of time, fighting political rivals in those elections were now fighting COVID deniers, lockdown skeptics, etc. And this was a really poisonous situation. You do not want to be in a situation where you, as a radical movement, are saying the state should have more power than it currently does. You do not want to be handing more authority to censor and to control movement, and even, my God, even to force people to take injections. This is something I haven't quite psychologically gotten over. It's strange in the UK because we never had formal vaccine mandates, at least not in England. There was some things that were some behaviours contingent on vaccination in Scotland and Wales, but in England, I ultimately I say thank God for Boris Johnson, because it's hard to imagine any other leader resisting that international norm of something that is completely perverted and evil to me, actually, of forcing people to take vaccination. The bottom line, I appreciate I'm going on here, but the bottom line is that the WHO and international health organisations that were set up after the Second World War had in their founding constitutions the belief that health emergencies needed to be treated with local consent and with local specificity. That all went out the window with COVID. And there is a narrative that we could tell here, and it's parallel with the story of neoliberalism. But at the end of the day, this was the point where any kind of assumption that health emergencies have to be treated locally with attention to the local dynamics of the place, they have to use local expertise and local methods, and they have to have local consent. There was none of that. The same measures that were imposed in America were imposed in Nigeria, were imposed in Britain, were imposed in India. This is crazy to try to force the same measures on every single place, and the consequences have been disastrous. Nobody, even a lot of the skeptics, don't quite have the mojo to talk about it now. There's plenty of other things to talk about, but this was world historical. And the left failed the test. There were many things the left could have been doing, even if you really, really believed that COVID was a lot worse than it turned out to be. There were many things the left could have been doing instead of siding with Bill Gates and empowering their own governments against any sense of individual choice or individual freedom of movement and communication.
So this is why I love listening to you, because when you talk, I suddenly find like all of these little paths. I'm like, wait, I hadn't thought about it this way. Now I want to go pursue this. And a little bit ago, you were like, oh, sorry, I'm going on. I'm like, no, that's why you're on here. You're on here to go on, so it's okay. But so I have a couple of like specific thoughts on that situation, and I'm curious to hear what you think about this. So. First of all, there was the tension between kind of an older organized left and the COVID mandate. So in France, particularly, you saw this, where on mainland Europe, for the most part, it was much stricter than it ever was in the United States or in the UK.
Yes.
So it was very bizarre listening to people say, "Oh, we need more mandates," and I'm looking around at what it's like here. And it's like, "Oh no, this is terrifying. You do not want this." But in France, particularly, the unions were resisting and fighting the government's requirement that you can only go to work if you take this amount of vaccines. Mm-hmm. Because for them, that was like you can't tell workers what they have to do in order to be allowed to work. Like this is going to ruin or undermine the power of the unions. And then eventually, those unions caved. In the United States, there was not, because there's not much of a union presence in the United States. But you did see some of that in Canada, where the Freedom Convoy, which people love to make fun of, that was specifically truck drivers, most of whom were immigrants, saying, "Hey, no, you should not be requiring us to do this in order to work. If we don't work, we starve. And now you're telling us that there is this extra mandate that we must do." So that was one big issue. Another one, though, that I think, if there was a justification for the lockdowns or the masking from a government perspective or from a larger perspective, if there was an authentic justification for that, it was that the hospitals were becoming overwhelmed. Now, hospitals being overwhelmed is a problem of infrastructure investment. What had been happening in the United States, the United Kingdom, and especially also here in Europe, is that the governments had been running the hospitals at the absolute barest minimum staffing. They weren't capable of dealing with any sort of issue like this, and so the requirement was like, or the real statement was, because we have not been spending any money on these things, and so all of our hospitals are understaffed. We don't have enough rooms. We don't have enough respirators. We don't have enough anything. Therefore, we're going to punish you. We're gonna throw all of this on you. We've had this austerity program happening for several decades, and now it's your fault that now you're using our hospitals too much. So no, you may not leave your house. No, you may not go to work. No, you may not do any of these things, because if you do, you're going to overwhelm the hospitals that we have specifically not been funding. And it seems like no one on the left ever picked up on that. Like no one picked up on the fact that would have been a brilliant pressure point, especially for, like the Corbynism or even like the Sandersism, I guess, and say, hey, look, we, the liberals specifically have not been creating a system that actually supports humans. And so the left can offer something better. But instead all of that energy was thrown into, okay, so you need to stay home. And if you did not stay home, then you have just killed grandma.
Absolutely. In the UK, there was a great show made of the creation of what were called Nightingale Hospitals, where sort of temporary hospital sites were created with loads of beds in them, lots of equipment. And most of these just stood empty for the entire pandemic. And why? You could have very quickly trained a huge tranche of young people who were not at risk and who would have been very happy to be part of some sort of blitz spirit exercise, and you could have had a huge amount of even only the most simple kind of palliative care taking place. There's a reason why that most simple measure didn't happen. There's a reason why all those people were at home playing Xbox instead of doing something useful. And that is because the lockdown measures, the COVID response, was designed explicitly to keep current social relations preserved in amber as much as possible. Even Britain's unusually generous furlough scheme, where everyone who was taken out of work got a percentage of their normal earnings. John McDonnell, Corbyn's right-hand man, was allegedly part of that process of designing that. A lot of Corbynites said this is a win for us, thank God we were around, otherwise everyone would have been left to starve. I don't think so. The keeping everyone on something like what they were earning before was a way of manufacturing a situation where we would come out of the crisis with social relations broadly untouched. If you had got a load of people who were destined to work in call centres or to bum around doing some temporary work in there whilst still living at home, or go into whatever useless email job, if you had gambled on giving them training or giving them a taste of a life where they were working in medicine or where they were driving around installing ventilators in schools, all that kind of thing, if you had created this sort of blitz-like work program where people who are not at risk from COVID had to do something in order to help placate the crisis, then you would have risked a situation where we would have come out of COVID, like Britain came out of the Second World War in 1945, and you would have a newly self-confident and newly skilled working class, just as you did back then, and they would start demanding stuff. So I think that it was pretty obvious what the left should have been demanding. It didn't demand it, and if it had demanded it, it would have met a lot of resistance because it would have been genuinely radical and transformative. Instead, we went along with, or begged to have more of, sort of stuff in the hole of underinvestment in all kinds of infrastructure by just checking out, by just staying home. I think a real sort of red pill moment for me was when we hit Christmas 2020, realizing that there was less hospital capacity than there was at the start of the year. Hospital capacity had been allowed to decline. Never mind it wasn't invested in further, it had been allowed to decline. And still we went into lockdown. It happened again the following year. Again, fewer hospital spaces even in existence in the country. And yet the left was begging to go back into lockdown in 2022 as well. Thank Christ that didn't happen. So, in other words, lockdown was there in order to permit the government to continue with underinvestment, to continue with a completely, fake de facto privatization where health services are run by these competing trusts and almost everything is outsourced. This is a health infrastructure that is not designed to handle to produce a kind of concerted response to a crisis. And okay, some people would say yes, this is all true, but given that we had to go into lockdown, I would at least expect those people to be saying that something should change about that health service or that health provision, or indeed that entire industrial strategy. But very few people who got really heavy on we need more COVID restrictions found much time for asking for the kind of infrastructure that would make future lockdowns unnecessary. And the simple reason is a lot of people liked being in lockdown, or even as it was destroying their whole psychology.
Well, especially if you were, a remote worker of any sort already, for folks like that, there's no real change. Two other things I think about that moment, and then after this, I want to talk about what's happening now with like the pro-Palestinian protests, because I think this is a really large moment, and it's something that you've brought up quite often as well. But there's two other issues related to that. One thing, I feel like the justification for a lot of okay, so maybe better put, the left lost a really huge chance, a very powerful chance, and actually I think abdicated this chance completely when they argued that populations needed to be forced to do something to their body because, or in the name of public health or what have you. Because for me, I've always found it interesting that Roe versus Wade in the United States was overturned during this time. And there are all kinds of arguments that you can make, all kinds of justifications or frameworks you can make to say, people should be allowed to do these things. But one of them is body sovereignty. Now, that a human being should be able to do what they choose with their body, within limits, as provided it is not harming someone else, and provided that they are informed, are able to consent to those things, then they should be able to do what they like. That, of course, is seen more as a kind of right-wing libertarian idea right now. But if you look back, it was actually a concept that the left often stood for. And particularly on the subject of abortion, where it's like, well, maybe this is not the ideal situation, but a woman should be able to do this because it's her body. But you lost that completely when you said, but you should be required to mask. No, a human must be required to have this vaccine. So the left no longer can argue without looking completely hypocritical that, humans should be able to do certain things with their bodies, but absolutely not things that are even less intrusive on their bodies or less, or something that they're even less willing to do. And one issue too, and it's kind of a side issue, but I think that's always been something that would help resolve a lot of the deadlocks that you see with like gender identity right now. Where it's like, okay, well, you don't necessarily need to force everybody to believe that this person fits into this category because they say so, but you absolutely, or a left could absolutely stand for what this person wants to do with their body is fine. Because that's not something that governments, that's not something that the powerful should be able to determine on that. And that just completely got abdicated during that moment. But another thing, and this is something that I'd actually honestly say, like, you're perfectly just immune to it for some reason, or maybe you've just seen it and it just doesn't matter to you. But during the COVID moment, especially in what was happening in Germany, that was the point at which this, the terror or the accusation of a red-brown alliance or, a left-right fascist, like Marxists, coalescence really started to adhere. You had anarchists talking about it for a while. Alexander Reed Ross in the United States, who was an Antifa activist, he had been talking for a while about, hey, there are leftists who are making are becoming basically fascist. They're talking to the Browns. In Germany, when you saw massive populist protests that contains people who were politically left, politically right, politically unaffiliated, you had hippie green type people, and then you also had nationalists, but then you also had communists, all marching together saying, hey, no, don't do this. The government cannot do this. And the reaction, particularly in the American press, but I also saw this in the UK press as well, was that, hey, now something really awful is happening now. This is a new fascism. Like leftists and fascists are mixing together, and we need to police any potential discussions between the right, because this is going to turn into a movement that will destroy the world. And I think that was the point where that argument was considered finished. That was a done deal. This is what's happening. And so now we're in a situation where, you've written for Compact, I write for Compact. That immediately, if you ask a whole section of people, they'll say, yeah, that's red-brown. You can't write there. You know, I've written for and heard, and it's the same thing. Like, I've had people accuse me of being a fascist because I've written there. That argument, you know, that's something that the COVID moment coalesced that and solidified it, so that we're kind of stuck now. When we're trying to even have any sort of discussion and saying, actually, some of these critiques on the right make sense, and we should remember these used to be our critiques.
Yes.
30 years ago, this is what the left was standing for. Something has changed. We're stuck there. And I started that part of the discussion by saying, like, you seem immune to it, right? Like, there's this almost like, yeah, whatever.
One prominent leftist, I think, was referring to me when he warned of the glamour of reaction, and my response was, "Oh, he thinks I'm glamorous."
Well,
okay,
I'm reactionary trash, so
the Red-Brown Alliance. Okay, for one thing, what is this? What is the brown part? When you actually look at it, what is the fascist claim that these undesirable interlocutors allegedly have? The vast majority of the time, the bad part of it is just normal conservatism. It's put it this way: for quite a lot of people on the left, if you have socially conservative views and you are a free market neoliberal capitalist, then that's safe. That's just a normal conservative, and there's nothing pathological about that. If, however, you have normal conservative social views, you're sceptical about trans things, you want limits on abortion, you're anti-immigration, but you favour a more interventionist industrial policy. If you favour something like Steve Bannon's economic project, if you favour something like the kinds of higher investments that a lot of the right-wing pro-Brexit campaigners were promising back in 2016, if, in other words, you are right on social issues like every other conservative, but more left on the economy, then suddenly you're a pathological fascist, which rather begs the question of which the bad part is. It's as if people become alarmed when somebody has normal conservative social views, but adds a measure of leftism into the economic analysis. I think that describes compacts and Sohrab Ahmari pretty accurately, and it applies to most of what goes on at the American Conservative as well. So I think that it is pretty clearly a myth, first of all, that there really is a brown for the red to get involved with. I welcome it when I'm a materialist. I believe in the base before the superstructure, and if there are some on the right who want to change the base in a way that I think is a step in the right direction, then great, so be it. Zizek has disowned the argument, but he was right in 2016 when he said a leftist should vote for Trump. I think he has been vindicated in that, because, okay, Bidenomics are obviously inadequate, but if it was Bernie doing Biden's economic policies, that we'd all be saying, yeah, but under the circumstances of American capitalism, it's great. I think that there has been a sort of statist turn, there has been an investment turn. It's not adequate, but it's completely different, a completely different normal to what there was before Trump. So I think that strategically, I'm deeply unworried by it, and we're not. It's not really we're not in the driver's seat. It's not the decision of the left whether parts of the right start to question neoliberalism, but we certainly shouldn't be the ones who are stopping it happening or opposing it or part of the propaganda effort against it. Then add to that, it is the simple fact that on COVID and on the war in Ukraine, the left has completely abandoned its responsibilities to stand up for freedom, stand up for the working class, stand up for the preservation of current liberal norms about freedom of debate and so on, and has become, on COVID, propagandist in chief, and on Ukraine, very weak and more interested in cancelling people on the left as tankies or as Putinists than it has been in presenting an important the very important coherent case against escalation in Ukraine. I mean, this is a bigger topic than we want to get into, but basically I wouldn't want the left to have been in power in 2020 if they were the zero COVID party. I wouldn't want the left to be in power in 2022 if they were the Azov Battalion party.
Right.
Things are looking a little different now. They're moving in the right direction now. But in those moments, hell yeah, I was in a red-brown alliance, because those naughty Trump supporters and those Tucker Carlson viewers were the only people who were making arguments I agreed with about the most basic, liberal norms around those two crises. The left was nowhere to be seen.
All right, so I have one more thought that came up earlier from something you had said that I want to touch on before we go to the Israel thing. We absolutely need to do that because it's the moment right now. But I was wondering, do you feel like through Brexit and through COVID and then also through Ukraine, the left started replacing the internationalist worker framework with an internationalist NGO framework? I mean, or because that's felt like what's happened where, it used to be, workers are the same class in every country. Yeah, their situations are different, but we have the same concerns, and so therefore should work internationally beyond national borders. That seems to have gone away, and instead, in Brexit, one of the arguments was like, well, we are, becoming isolationist. Like, the international order or internationalist order of the EU is important. We're part of this community. Something similar happened with COVID, where the WHO and all of these other organizations are saying this. Therefore, we should listen to them because we're part of this international community. And again, with NATO and Ukraine, like the NATO needs to all get together because we're part of this international community. But it used to. I mean, that was never what the left was doing before. Before it was, these workers' unions in this country are opposing this policy, so we need to support them because we are part of this worker community.
I think it's a longer story. I will say that, yeah, absolutely. When I hear the word internationalism today, I reach for my ice pick. But it's a longer story. It goes back to the 1970s. Tom Nairn, a very, very great Scottish intellectual of the New Left, died last year. I will refer to him for many things. Fascinating little book that he wrote called The Left Against Europe in 1974, as Britain was entering the prototype of the EU. And he lays it out explicitly there that this is the future of socialism, because our economic arguments are right. If we enter into this technocratic supranational body that is only going to be guided by economic self-interest, then it is going to end up being socialist. This is the argument he made in the 1970s, and that is so palpably wrong. We can recognise in retrospect, many saw it as wrong at the time, Tony Benn among them, Jeremy Corbyn among them, but that became that is the story of the left over the succeeding decades. After the Soviet Union fell, you have people like Perry Anderson, people like Christopher Hitchens saying, well, we can no longer look to actually existing socialism abroad. We can no longer look to militant trade unions as a way of inaugurating socialism at home. The best we can hope for is to submit to these supranational organisations and hope that we can change them from above, and also hope that we can plug the dam and stop the worst excesses of neoliberalism by having these sort of forms of super regulation at the international level. That's international, Trotskyist internationalism transformed into a sort of technocratic submission to anti-democratic supranational institutions. That's the story of the left basically since the 1970s, as far as I'm concerned. There was a brief breaking of that mindset in that 2016-2017 moment where the Bernie bros said Trump's got a point, and where the Corbyn supporters said, I didn't vote for Brexit, but I'm going to go along with it. That was the exceptional moment where we got sovereignty, where we finally understood again that socialism, if it is to come, must come with the consent of the workers and through the actions of the workers. It is not going to come from in this kind of perverted simulacrum of socialism that you get from bodies like the EU, or indeed we can now say the WHO, or any of the NGOs. Indeed. So that socialism from above has been the story for too long. There was a flicker of left populism which recognised the value of sovereignty and was able to resist it for a moment, but now we're back in socialism from above mode, and have been since at least 2020, if not before.
Sure.
Yeah. Oh, one other thing I was going to say in response to that was that I mean that socialism from above, that kind of NGOification, all of these are forms of anti-populism. All of which is the great temptation of the left. Anti-populism is where you think, okay, I do want a dictatorship of the proletariat. I do want the liberated working class to come, but these guys, the ones we've got right now, I do not trust them as far as I would throw them. And that can take the form of, assuming that they are just fascist and wrong about niche things that we care about. But it can also take the form of adopting policy positions where you just don't trust ordinary people. It was quite lonely being a left lockdown skeptic, because unlike on a lot of issues, it wasn't as if lockdown was massively unpopular. If there'd been a referendum on lockdown, it would have won, and we would have stayed in lockdown in 2020 and probably afterwards. The reason why it was anti-populist was not because it was unpopular. It was anti-populist because it assumed that people are fucking idiots who can't be trusted to not just run out of the house, cough on each other, lick lampposts, go to raves when they're obese 60-year-olds, etc., etc. When in actual fact, there is plenty of evidence that says that Britain famously delayed its lockdown. This is supposedly when it all went wrong, the original sin of Boris Johnson. I don't really buy it. But in that window where COVID was here, but we weren't locked down, there you can see in mobile phone records that vulnerable people stayed home. People made their own restrictions. People made judgments based on their own family situation, their own health situation. If you've been honest with people about the nature of the risks, then they would have been extremely wise, actually, about how they reacted to COVID. The left's wholesale embrace of the most stringent restrictions was, and its welcoming of a censorship regime because people can't be trusted to not watch YouTube and then immediately inject themselves with bleach. This assumption that people are passive sheeple, which is what both the outright and the radical left both think quite a lot of the time. Right. That is the anti-populism that means that you trust bureaucrats more than you trust the people. But I don't. I trust the people.
Yeah, and you can't build a movement from below if you're telling people that they're idiots and they can't be trusted. That's a complete contradiction. So finally, I'd love to talk about what are your observations about what's happening now with you call them specifically the activist left, the pretty massive protests. I mean, I feel like this is the first time that we've really seen a real leftists kind of upwelling where there's almost unification on the left, at least on this one issue. I mean, with the exception of the German left, they're just a mess right now. But this gives you a lot of optimism, which it gives me optimism too. I mean, some days I have absolutely no optimism at all, and I'm one of those people who's just thought like, wow, it'd be a lot easier if I just stopped calling myself left. You know, that wouldn't feel true to myself, but you know, like, wow, how delightful that would be. So what are you seeing, and what do you think might come next? Like, or what do you think can come next out of these, you know, mobilizations?
Well, I don't want to sound too optimistic. I think that the activist left is getting it right. I think that these protests have had some local good outcomes. You know, the left is as uninfluential in the immediate sense as it's ever been. And if there is a ceasefire in Gaza, if there is a reckoning with the Zionist project, if there is a reckoning with how the West relates to Israel, weapons, diplomacy, all of this, then it won't principally be a result of protests. It'll be a result of the coming multipolar world. The fact that America and its outposts aren't the only game in town, increasingly. Mm-hmm. But let me put it a little more locally. During the various crises since 2019 that we've been describing here, there formed, you know, I wasn't the only one. You and I weren't the only ones. There was a sort of subculture which I would refer to as the dissident left. You know, some people would say materialist left, some people would say post-left, some would say paleo-left. But let's say there was a dissident left that defined itself against the activist left, that defined itself against those Corbyn supporters who have become lockdown supporters, who became, you know, paid up Black Lives Matter, you know, folks, etc., etc. And this was a largely intellectual movement. It's important to stress that. It wasn't having chapter meetings in cities. It wasn't organising protests or trying to form a political party. It was cultural production. It was academics and content creators on programs, making programs like this one, often using technologies that had advanced quite a lot because of lockdown, ironically enough. And this dissident left, you know, basically took the view that something like the view that I've taken on all the issues that we've mentioned on this episode, including having more conversations with people on the right, or at least being unhysterical about the nature of new right formations. And what is very interesting to me is that seems to have hit the rocks with the Gaza crisis. And there is suddenly, as you say, massive agreement on the broad activist left. There is no longer, you know, Owen Jones pointing the finger at, you know, whatever Corbin figure and denouncing them for anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. There's much less tone policing than there was during the COVID years. There's actually a very kind of sensible, pragmatic, and wholly justified, you know, presentation of serious feeling and analysis about Gaza on the activist left. Meanwhile, the dissident left, which I found myself in agreement with on so much in recent years, has sort of split between people like, I don't know, Glenn Greenwald, Thomas Farsi, who are very committed to the critique of Israel, a critique of Israel that I completely agree with, and the defence of Gaza. On the other hand, you've got people like, I don't want to sort of suggest all these people think the same thing, but let's just say people like Lee Phillips, Bungercast, Sublation Media to a great extent, Compact, others who seem a little embarrassed, if not outright hostile, to the activist left. In other words, there's a split between those who have regarded the Gaza response as, here we go again, here's another kind of example of the left getting it wrong, and those who say, well, no, actually the left is completely right on this one, and what is happening in Gaza and in the wider region is absolutely appalling, and there are things that we can and should be doing to resist it in our own countries.
So I promised an essay to a journal, and I still haven't written it yet because I go back and forth on whether or not I can deal with being yelled at like that again. But the topic of that was like specifically that the dissident left is divided on this issue, whereas the activist left is finally, again, as you and I would both say, finally getting it right. But I often wonder, and I think maybe this is the problem that you sort of see on the dissident left, where it's like they're getting it right, but not always for the right reasons. For example, when you attempt to apply a lot of the social justice identitarianism framework to the situation, it doesn't quite specifically work out. But there are much older, traditionally Marxist critiques that you can easily use and just say, well, yeah, I mean, anti-imperialism. That's a much simpler way of saying, or of looking at this framework than saying, and the same thing would have happened with Ukraine as well. If you could just still, like, we don't need to be doing these massive wars and these massive occupations, but instead a lot of it is, attempting to use the American race framework for the issue in Israel.